Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we're just taking a look at something a little bit different, and just to take a break from all the scenic work that's going on as well at the same time. And today we're looking at another project that I've been working on sort of in the background, and it's to do with Class 20's. Now, I would have to say my favourite all-time locomotive is the Class 24's and Class 25's. I don't know what it is, they just really appeal to me. But coming in at a very, very close second is the Class 20's. Now, one of the things that I absolutely love about the Class 20's is their very unique sounds they make. So today's video looks at a sound project that I worked on with two of my Class 20's. Now, looking at the Class 20's I have here in front of me, I have four Class 20's. Now, two of them are actually dummy Class 20's and two of them are powered. So the first Class 20 I ever bought was a Bachmann Class 20, which is this one here, and it is the factory weathered version. And previously, not long after I'd actually bought it, I had added sound to it, and I'd used a Soundtrax UK sound decoder with an iPhone speaker. And of course I did a video on that, which is up in the top corner if you wanted to go and have a look. So the next Class 20 in this lineup is a Lima Class 20. So it's very old and it's quite low on detail, and I picked it up very, very, very cheap second hand, simply to actually use as a dummy locomotive to pair up with a powered Class 20. I haven't actually really done that because there's an awful amount of weight in this Lima, despite the fact that I've removed all the motors and gearing out of it. But this locomotive was used as a weathering exercise, just to sort of upskill myself in the process of weathering locomotives. So the third in the lineup, we go back to a Bachmann Class 20, and in most respects it is really identical to the first Class 20 that I actually bought. This is of course the pristine version, and it is a great runner for a second-hand locomotive. And then finally the last locomotive, which I'd actually bought not too long ago, and this was originally a Bachmann factory fitted sound locomotive, which had a Locksound 3.5 decoder in it. Now, unfortunately, this locomotive actually became a bit of a lemon because various bits were actually missing, windows pushed in, components broken off, a buffer missing, and its running characteristics were absolutely shocking. Not to mention the sound file on the Locksound version 3.5 was pretty average as well. So that's the lineup of my current stock of Class 20's. Now, the focus of today's video is with these two Class 20's. So this is the pristine Class 20, which is in very good order and runs like a dream. And then of course the Class 20 here, which was basically a dog's breakfast. And what my intentions are is to pair these two locomotives up, but to actually be able to put some substantial sound into the dummy locomotive. So I think without further ado, let's just see what I got up to. So this is the operational Bachmann Class 20, and I purchased a Coastal DC Locksound 5 decoder with their sound file loaded up, and of course that comes with the Sugar Cube speaker. So I've attached that in there, and we just sort of got that temporarily attached in there. So what the plan is to put this mega bass speaker, which currently is just blue tacked to the end of this because I've been testing to make sure that I had the polarity around the right way, is pop this speaker into this dummy Bachmann Class 20. Now, as I mentioned before, it had full motor workings inside, but now it's just a free running locomotive. So the main thing is that although I'll probably have these two locomotives paired up quite often, I still want to be able to operate this locomotive independently at times as well. So the main thing really is to whatever cable connection I have between these two locomotives when they're hooked up is that it can be detached. So what I'm actually using is these extension wires which DCC Concepts produce, and they come with 2-pin micro JST plugs on the end, and then you've also got these little connection boards as well, and I think they'll do the trick. Of course, I'm going to have to paint the wires because you'll be able to see the red wire, and the main thing really is to attach this in such a way that it doesn't actually foul the coupling system in here. So that is basically the idea, and because all the motor workings have been stripped from this locomotive, there's plenty of room in here to put the speaker. Now this is a Soundtrax mega bass speaker, and what I'm actually going to do is make up a baffle or enclosure for the speaker so that we get a even more solid sound out of it. So there's going to be some modifications to this as well. Now, rather than actually videoing this whole process, I think it's just going to be a little bit too tricky, so we'll just sort of check in at various stages and show the progress, and then hopefully at the end of this we'll be able to test it out and see how it sounds. So I've moved on a little bit further with this. Now this is obviously the powered locomotive, and it has the Locksound 5 decoder in it, and it was already pre-wired with this little sugar cube speaker here, and it was actually wired up to some of the pin tabs right at this end. So I thought, well, I'll just leave that wiring there. Of course, I've had to actually extend the wires. They weren't actually long enough where the speaker is now mounted down at this end, which is where the fan grill is on the roof. So the other speaker wires, which are going to lead out into the dummy class 20 locomotive, are connected to the speaker tabs actually on the locomotive PCB board. So there was a little bit of nervous kind of modification that I had to do to the chassis, and one is to drill a tiny little wee hole through the chassis at this end, and then down at the end where the buffer beam will be, I've cut a little wee notch into the chassis there, and that corresponds to a notch in the buffer beam, which you can just sort of make out there. Now the reason I've done that is because the wires really couldn't go underneath the buffer beam because the coupling is just so close. There is really not a lot of gap, so I've had to do it this way. It's not ideal, but you know, it works. This cable here, of course, I will just paint this black, like a matte black, and also this part of the white plug as well, to try and disguise it as much as possible. And that is essentially this part of the conversion. So if we take a look at the chassis of the dummy locomotive, now this looks nothing like what it originally used to be. It was a second-hand class 20 that I picked up. It was actually a Bachmann DCC sound fitted version, so factory fitted sound, and the sound was appalling. The running characteristics of it were absolutely shocking, and no matter what I did, it just wouldn't really come right. And I think the problem was is the previous owner had done things with the drive shaft and the gear mechanism and things like that, and had inadvertently put the gearboxes around the wrong way, and they'd got all warped. And so essentially at the end of the day, unfortunately, this locomotive was really just not suitable for running. And I thought, what am I going to do with it? And I thought, well, why not turn it into a dummy locomotive? And as we are doing in this video, I can put in a larger speaker. So when I converted this over, of course, I stripped the locomotive out and I kept some of the parts, like the motor. I think the motor was probably reasonably okay condition, so I sort of salvaged that, and that goes into my parts bin. But I wanted to alleviate some of the weight from the chassis. Obviously, being a dummy locomotive, I didn't want it being too heavy and leaving it up to the powered locomotive to have to lug this around, plus a whole lot of wagons. So I actually cut away a vast chunk of the original motor housing and gearbox housings, and essentially replaced it with plasticard that was fixed into place, and used the central motor mount, which you can just see here, as the fixing point for this plasticard construction. And then of course that has got little wee brass rivets that are poked through there, which of course hold the existing bogies into place, which are sort of quite an unusual sort of method that they're housed in here. So in the end it actually worked quite well, and it certainly has taken an awful lot of weight out of the locomotive chassis. So originally there wasn't this big cut notch in the middle here. This is actually where the speaker is going to go, and originally it just went straight across. So I've cut this section out, and this is where this mega bass speaker is going to sit in there. So what I'm doing in terms of the connection, so as we know on this locomotive here, it's just simply a wire poking out. Now, I mean, it's not ideal, because if I want to run this locomotive by itself as an independent locomotive, then I've got this wire poking out, but I'm sure I'll be able to sort of figure out a way where I can sort of tuck it in underneath the frame and just hide it if need be. So the plug, of course, is on this end of the cable, and then at this end on this locomotive you can see I have a socket. So essentially this chassis also had itself modified where the buffer beam would be, and I have fixed in this little bit of circuit board, which is the socket. So as you saw at the beginning, I had those little adapter sockets, and essentially basically I've cut the end off it, and what I'll do is solder some wires onto those tabs there, and then that will run in through the underneath of the chassis and connect up to the speaker. So that is the plan. So this is my homemade hodgepodge housing for the speaker. So unfortunately the speaker was just a little bit too wide to fit within the Class 20 chassis, so I had to cut the edges off either side of the speaker, and on one side I think I went a little bit too close, and so I've had to glue that up, which is why it looks a little bit of a mash job, because I've used the Zap glue instead of a styrene cement, because it's a little bit more flexible and it sort of has a bit of a rubbery quality to it. Because I was sort of thinking, well, if I've actually cut into the diaphragm of the speaker, then that's just going to rattle. So that's what I've done, and then of course it is sealed on the back as well, and that the rest of the construction was using just some styrene cement. Now there's a black sort of blob here, and you're wondering what that is. Now that is milliput or milliput putty, which is setting at the moment, and that is essentially just to seal the hole where the speaker wire goes in. And then also this particular mega bass speaker had mounting holes for screws, and so I've had to fill those as well, so they've been filled in with milliput. And I've done some testing on this, so I did some testing before I filled the holes, and the housing certainly makes a difference to the speaker. It definitely makes it into a more sort of wholesome kind of a sound. And then when I filled these in, it makes even more of a difference. So it's definitely highly recommended that with any speaker really, that you put it in some kind of airtight housing, and it really does make a huge difference. So I'm still just waiting for this to really dry off. I'll probably give it a lick of paint to kind of tidy it up just a little bit, but essentially this speaker is going to sit in here, so it'll be positioned in there, and then a little bit more styrene cement to anchor that into place, and then of course the speaker wire will feed out down to the socket down here at the end, and that's what the plan is, and hopefully it's all going to work out. So as I mentioned, I have done some testing, and I've temporarily had the speaker hooked up to the other locomotive, and everything's all in order. It's all working so far. So yeah, we'll continue on with progress and see what the final outcome is. So I've now reassembled both locomotives. The one on the right is the powered locomotive, and the one on the left is the dummy. And I've just painted those cables in there, and you can see in there, you can probably just sort of see the socket. So it looks reasonably discreet. It almost looks a little bit like vacuum pipes. So we'll fire this up and see how it sounds, and what I'll do is I'll bring my lapel mic closer to each of the locomotives, and hopefully you might be able to pick up the sound coming from both locomotives. So there we have it. That is the sound project for these two Class 20 locomotives, and it's worked out quite well. I will have to say the lapel mic doesn't really do the justice in recording the sound very well, because there was quite a significant difference between the two locomotives, but in reality it's actually not that different. There's definitely more bass coming from the dummy locomotive, because of course that's got the mega bass speaker in it, and of course we're getting the nice fine high pitched tones coming from the sugar cube speaker in the other locomotive. So I've also actually run these locomotives around the layout in various configurations and on track routes, and there is no issues whatsoever with the cables connecting the two locomotives together, and it also hauls a reasonable rate of wagons. So I think in the next episode on Station Road, of course, we'll return back to the scenic work around the hill section, and also probably hopefully make a start on the churchyard and other areas like that. And hopefully as well at the same time, once we've got some of that scenery in, we'll get these locomotives paired up and include a wee running session with the sound operating. So once again, thank you all for watching. Thank you to all those who subscribe to the channel or have recently subscribed, and also to all of those who leave their wonderful comments. So I'll leave it there for now. Do take care everyone, and look after yourselves, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.